Hello, class. So, Dr. Jones here again, making our discussion video for this week. So, for today, you read Landing on the Wrong Note by Gloria Ladson Billings. That's just kind of talking about this legacy of desegregation and what lots of people don't know and don't understand about this very, very important part of our history as a nation. And so last week you read about the actual implementation of desegregation plans, one in Atlanta, one in St. Louis. And also the weeks before that, you were reading about just like some of the things that were going on in segregated schools before all of this happened. And so I put these specifically together essentially to get to this point, to be able to stand back and think about, okay, so what does that mean? What does all of this mean together? I told you at the beginning of the semester, like, if you stick with me, I promise it will start to make sense and things will start to come together. And really, this is the time that I see it starting to come together. So, like some of you maybe, as you were reading about desegregation and reading about all of the complicated ways that it was implemented, you might have been curious about like what happened in the place where you were from. And if you were curious about that, I hope that you did check out the Forgotten Voices article, because it talks a lot about how desegregation went down in St. Louis. Just a little snapshot into my history, and also why I find it so important to talk about this history is like when I specifically read that Atlanta desegregation article, I remember thinking like, that is so crazy. They went from segregation to segregation, and this isn't at all what you're taught about Brown v. Board in school. You're definitely taught this idea, Ladson Billings calls it a mythology, this story that like, oh, we had Brown v. Board, and then everyone was like, oh yes, we got rid of segregation, that like we all decided that was bad, that was a big moral victory for all of us. And with reading those articles, I was like, wait, was it not a big moral victory? Did it not solve everything, even though we're living every single day in the proof that it didn't solve everything? And so when I read that, that's when I first started like looking out, like I want to know how it happened in St. Louis. And I found this great book. I gave you just like an article, but I found this book that was all about the St. Louis desegregation case. And I was like flipping through this book, and I wanted to kind of compare the timelines. And I was flipping through this book, and the pages were talking about like the 1970s, and I'm like, okay, that's pretty normal. It was like going into the 80s, and it's coming to the 90s, and I'm just like, wait a minute, like this is my lifetime now. I'm alive now. What is happening? And so I'm thumbing through these pages. I'm trying to find like the end of it, basically. And I get to this page, and it's listing a year that I was in elementary school. It listed my elementary schools as one of the St. Louis County elementary schools that had Black students in it, and it had a number of how many Black students it had in that year. And I'm looking at this, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm one of those students. Like I'm reported here. This is insane, because immediately I had to abandon my original assumption of what desegregation was. My original assumption was like in 1954, a time way before my time, we solved this issue, and whatever problems that we have now, it's not because of this issue. Whereas I'm seeing this and I'm looking at it and I see that I'm one of these students that they're talking about. I'm like, wow, it wasn't solved. It wasn't solved in my time. It's not solved now. And no one really talked to me about it. And so like that connects with why I think this is so important. I knew that I wanted to be a teacher that talked to people about it because it's important. So hopefully by now you have read the whole article. If not, I suggest that you do that before you answer our discussion topics. I have 3 things I want you to do, like 3 separate little activity things. Anyway, first one is I want you to give me your top 3 facts from the reading that you think everybody should know. And tell me why you think everybody should know. Here's my top 3. There are way, way, way more than 3. I expect yours to be different from mine. Anyway, here's my top 3. I think everybody should know that there's a big difference between Brown 1 and Brown 2. As she talks about in the article, Brown 1, of course, like that's the one that makes everybody feel better. We all said that separate is inherently unequal. It's bad. It's not what our democracy is supposed to mean. Everyone, yes, kumbaya, high five. We all agree with that. Brown 2, the 3 most important words, all deliberate speed, is that even though we all agree on the importance of equality in our democracy, we're willing to give you a big Olympic-sized pool worth of leg room on what that means and how you're actually going to do it. And to generations of people who have been in power, who have been the dominant culture, excuse me, I'm not sick. Anyway, to generations of people that have been in power, and you say, oh, you definitely have to dismantle what you see as important to that power, but you can kind of do it in, the pace that you want and make it look like how you want. And so obviously people are like, okay, so I'm not going to do that. I'm not actually going to do it. You read about last week about like the overwhelming backlash of white flight out of schools that were desegregating, which is part of the reason why Atlanta went from segregation to slight deseg to just more segregation. And where we are now is we're so much more segregated now than we were in 1965, which is insane. So that's one, everybody should understand that because it says so much about why we are where we are if we know that there was never really a victory here and it was never really implemented in the way that we were kind of made to assume it was implemented. Next, second one is that the reality of racism is so much more complicated than just schools and even like just looking at any part of our culture. It's so much more complicated, but, and this is an important but, it's still man-made. I think if anything I wanted to build up in this semester is that all of these things are the foundations of our education. We created it. They came from culture of the colonists. They came from the culture of the many different languages and ways of life of people. They came from the culture, obviously, of the southern states that were like, I don't really care about education. I really just want to make money. It came from all of these places. And even though it's so much more complicated, and even though it is so prevalent and so strong, it doesn't mean that we can't unmake those things. Like, even though it's more complicated, it is still vulnerable to change, and people can still choose to change it. Third thing I think everybody should understand is that in the implementation of Brown, in what we later saw as limited desegregation, 30 to 50,000 Black educators lost their jobs or were demoted. 30 to 50,000, and that's just like in the South. And so if you think about 2 weeks ago, when you're thinking about the things that Black educators were putting into educating Black children that later became important thought leaders in the civil rights movement, all of the generations of work and care that those teachers put into was largely lost. It was gone. And even more than, Ladson Billings kind of talks about how the impact that has on a culture, especially that even in like the era where we saw a little bit of desegregation, if Black children were still not seeing Black teachers, Black adults that, they had to respect and see as legitimate, that has a big impact on the culture. It has a big impact on how Black people see the teaching profession. And I think that we could go on and on and on and on about the impact of losing 30 to 50,000 Black educators that, again, were trained, had more training than some of their white counterparts, and had the passion to teach Black children to create a world that didn't exist yet, that in very real ways they tried to make exist in the civil rights movement. And so those are 3 things that I think everybody should know and why. I want you also to comment 3 facts from this article that you think everyone should know and why. Try to choose 3 things different from mine. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say for that. So next. So Ladson Billings also puts forth some really interesting arguments that I want to hear your thoughts on. First, she talked about how in defending Brown, in selling why segregation should be knocked down, that people really focused on Black inferiority and did not focus as much on challenging and critiquing white supremacy. And I found that as very, very important, and also an argument that we've been building up to. If you think about how we've been talking about differential racialization, we've talked about how various falsehoods, various stereotypes were then used to create this unequal education system. And so we see all of the ways that inferiority was taken and we did not critique the white supremacy part of it. And so I want your thoughts on, or expand on, examples of times where we see a problem, say it's a problem like the achievement gap or something like that, and we focus more on the inferiority and assumed inferiority of minority students and less on the white supremacy, the systems that created it. So I use this as an example because it makes me think of another very important part in my personal history that led me here. This makes me think of, so going back to when I realized that, holy cow, I desegregated my elementary school and nobody told me. I've thought about other times in my education. I've mentioned to you that I went to Kirkwood schools. Those are county schools. I happen to live like right on the corner of the Kirkwood school district. And so I wasn't bussed in, but I was one of only a handful of Black families that actually lived in the school district. And even though I know, we had students from the city bussed in, we had a good, I would say maybe 20% Black population in the schools that I grew up in. For the most part, in my classes, I was usually one of one black person, one of two black people in my classes. And this was all the way through high school. And I didn't really I didn't do that math in my head that like, oh, there's actually too many black students in the school for there always to only be like one or two in every classroom. I didn't think about where are the other black students in my school until there's one year. I took an elective English class, something that sounded interesting to me. It was called Contemporary American Literature. And when I showed up for this class, it was in a hallway I had never been in before. I couldn't find the class. It was literally, I can't make this up, underneath the stairs. And so when I finally found it, I walked in and immediately I noticed that unlike every other class I had ever had in the school district, this was a classroom full of black students. Like black students I had never met before who probably were in my grade that I didn't even know. And other things that were unique about that class is that I remember there being no expectations of me. Like, I'm not even saying like low expectations, I'm saying none. Like the classes that I was used to challenged me. The classes that I was used to, I had a relationship with the teachers and I had some sort of rapport that made it so that I worked hard. And in this class, I had none of that. And so if you saw me as a junior in high school in this classroom, you probably would have thought that I didn't care much about thinking or being challenged or anything because there was no one challenging me. And I bring this up and I'm bringing it back to what I'm asking you about here, is that in that situation, I accepted the inferiority of the students in that classroom before I questioned, why is this classroom this way? Why does it happen that the only classroom that had other black students in it also lacked all of these other things that meant a better education in all of the other classes? So it's not like they didn't know what made a good educational experience, but it didn't exist in this classroom. And I did not question it. I really just lowered myself to the no standards. And even though I knew that I was losing something in it. And so again, my second task, my second question to you is just, can you think of other times where we kind of accept or think that it's more important to think about the assumed inferiority of minority students over being critical about white supremacy? So other examples I can throw out to you, and feel free to talk about this in your responses. Last week, you read about paradoxes of desegregation, where they talked about how history of standardized tests, like the SAT and the ACT that I know I took, I know most of you took, if you, most everybody still takes them, that those tests are 100% tied to desegregation, 100% tied to an effort to limit black people from being able to have a higher education. Same with teacher standards and certification standards. Many of you are working towards getting a teacher certification. And again, that those certifications, though they've gone through lots of different iterations over the years, they're still very much connected to this history of wanting to limit black people from a higher education, wanting to limit black people from being teachers and being certified to give back to their communities in that way. You can also think about this in the context of the pandemic that we are surviving through right now. Think about the disparities in how Black students have lower access to the internet, to computers, to I'm laughing because hopefully you can still hear me. There's a truck in the background. A limited access to a quiet place to do work. Is that focused on more than the issues of white supremacy that put us in this place where Black children have less of access to these things? I'm gonna wait for the truck to go by. Hey, how are you doing? Okay, it's gonna take forever to upload this. Has one more dumpster to do. I hope you're enjoying this video. Hopefully you can still hear me. Okay. So I think I only lost like 2 minutes or something like that. Maybe you were able to go and like get a glass of water. So in case that wasn't clear, the second thing I want you to expand on or think out loud while you're typing is just when we accept or assume the inferiority of Black students, brown students, students of color, versus being critical of white supremacy, being critical of the system that adds to that inferiority. If you can think of some examples of that and kind of add your thoughts on what you think about that as something that we're all guilty of. I know that I'm guilty of doing it, but it's important that we think about how to break those cycles. Okay, so third thing I want you to do is Ladson Billings also puts forward these two really interesting thoughts on how we can think about the legacy of the Brown decision. First thought, first question in this third part. Can real education exist without the inclusion of diverse and critical voices? I'll say that again. Can real education exist without the inclusion of diverse and critical voices? And so answer that, what you think and why. Maybe give me an example. And then second, she puts forward this idea that how has existing in a society that does not question white supremacy, how has that led to the miseducation of white students? How has not understanding this history of Brown, the impact of Brown, what it says about the experiences of Black people, how does that add to a miseducation of white students? If you can expand on this, and I know that I want you to think hard on this one because you don't always think of, and nor am I arguing that white students are the primary victims of this history, obviously not, but they are victims in a sense. And I want us to think about how does that limit a white person's ability to relate, to empathize, to understand the importance of the foundations of these systems that run our lives. So I want you to think on that. I'm putting all of these questions in the discussion forum. Responses, I would like them by 7 o'clock tonight. If because I don't know when this video is actually going to be uploaded. If you need more time, please email me and I can give you more time. I'm flexible on that. But this is what I want us to talk about for today. For Thursday, you have a choice between two articles. One is, again, kind of talking about the Brown case in St. Louis. The second one is called Second Class Integration. I actually like the second one a little bit more because, again, it kind of talks about what we lost in losing 30 to 50,000 Black teachers, in losing the Black teachers organizations that were working for the rights of Black children. And I think that that is maybe a more interesting read. And so you can choose from those two for doing your QCQ for Thursday. Anyway, thank you all. I hope you all are staying safe. It's gonna take a while to upload this. So thank you for being patient with me as well. Have a wonderful day.